Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, wherever you're coming from. Today I wanted to make a quick tutorial video on how to do testing, unit testing, integration testing with NestJS. So the code I'm starting with today is actually the code I had from a recent video on the NestJS versus Adonis. So this is the NestJS app from that video. You can also watch the NestJS crash course that I have, as well as my type ORM video, and if you kind of merge together what you learn from those two, you effectively will have the same application. But if you didn't see any of those videos but you have some decent understanding of Nest, let me just go over this code real quick. So basically we've got ourselves a users module, and within that users module you've got a users controller and a user service, and we're also injecting our repository for a users table in our database. You'll see in our users controller that basically we just have the basic CRUD, your typical create, read, update, and delete CRUD, right? So what we want to do here is figure out how we can unit test the controller, the service, and then later, if we have some time, we'll also cover our end-to-end testing, integration testing. So if you've seen my previous videos, you'll notice that I often use the Nest CLI to generate a lot of the files. And that's something that I highly recommend you also do, because it not only enforces a nice folder structure, but it also creates the test files for you automatically. And so it gives you kind of an initial skeleton to work with. So this file right here, I didn't write it from scratch. It was generated by the CLI. Before you get started with testing like this, ideally you know a little bit about Jest, because this is using Jest behind the scenes. When you run your test script, that's really just running Jest. And you need to be able to know the syntax of Jest, as well as how to do basic mocking and spying and doing assertions. If you haven't used Jest before, I think it's pretty intuitive. You'll see a good amount of examples in this video, so maybe just follow along. All right, so first let's talk about this bit right here. What's happening? So what's effectively happening is, as you can see, Nest is very much driven by this grouping mechanism called modules. And what we're really doing here is we're effectively sort of, think of it as we're creating a fake module on the fly. Kind of like how we have a users module here, which we can put this side by side, right? This users module has a controller and a user service. And we're sort of on the left here, kind of just trying to simulate the same thing, right? So you can see that we have a controllers and a providers. And we're really just trying to simulate I kind of think of it as the minimum module that you need to run your tests. So for example, if we were testing the controller, right, the user's controller, that really only has one dependency, which is the user service. As you can see in the constructor here, NestJS is during runtime would automatically inject the user service. And if we look at our initial testing module over here, you'll see that that's all we have. We got the user's controller and the user service, and we're effectively kind of simulating a isolated module for this one test. All right, so let's go ahead and run our test script. Specifically, I'm going to do test watch, so that as I change my code, it's going to rerun for me. And there's a lot of failures here because I didn't write the test yet. One of the things that I like to do with Jest, you can see here, if you press P to filter by file name, you can sort of have it focus on the file that you're currently working on. So in our case, we're going to do users controller, right? And it's failing on this one test. It should be defined. And the reason this is failing is because it's saying that it can't resolve one of the dependencies of the user service, which we'll get to, because if we look into the user service, right, this one has this repository dependency, which we use to connect to our database, but we're not providing that in our fake module here, right? You think of it as we're not running the real Nest application. We're just running a fake module. Now, with a unit test, typically what you want to do is as the name implies, you just want to test your smallest unit possible, and you generally want to mock your dependencies. You don't want it to kind of integrate things that you don't necessarily want to be integrated. So in this example, I don't necessarily care about the dependencies of the user service. I just want to be able to test the user's controller in isolation without kind of dealing with the real implementation of the user service. So the way to get around this is we need to be able to mock the user service so that we kind of simulate a fake user service that we can use in our test, which wouldn't involve the real dependency of the user service. All right, so to do that, we're going to introduce a new, let's call this mock user service. And I'm just going to make this an empty object for now. And down here, what you can do is you can add override provider, right? And you can see there's different types of overrides, right? So if you've got a guard or an interceptor and a pipe that you want to override, you can use one of those. But in this case, we specifically want to replace the user service that's being injected into our controller. So I'm going to do override user service, and then I'm going to say use value. And similarly here, there's three different approaches, right? This is really up to your preferences. You can provide a class and it's gonna instantiate that class for you. You can provide a factory function. I like to use value because it's just simple, and I can just provide a basic object, kind of like this one. So we're just gonna copy and paste that in there, and all of a sudden our test is passing, right? So now it's basically telling us that it's able to instantiate our user's controller, and it's able to bring in the user service dependency, and it kind of just stops from there, right? It's able to instantiate, right? It's able to compile in isolation. So generally with unit testing, that is the first step. You take a look at the thing you're testing in the constructor, what are its dependencies, right? And it's good to have a little bit of fundamentals on dependency injection. But if you don't, just think of it as pretty much anything in a Nest app that is defined as an argument for the constructor is a dependency that Nest will automatically inject into that constructor as it kind of builds instances of your classes. So it kind of handles the dependencies for you and kind of injects an instance of those things into your class, right? And in your test, your job is to just basically make sure that you're providing a proper instance of those dependencies, whether or not they're mocked. It's up to you to decide which ones you should mock and which ones you should use for real. Now, like I said, generally with unit testing, you just want to test the unit. You don't actually want to test them integrating together. So it's often likely that you're going to mock your dependencies on a unit test. All right, so we've got this one test. We're able to basically instantiate our controller, but that's not really useful, right? Let's add a more useful test in here. So if we take a look at the implementation of user's controller, what do we have in there? So on the right here, we have a create method that simply calls UserService.create. So a basic test for that is simply, we could do a basic, it should create a user, whatever message there that is meaningful to you. And you'll notice that in the left side here, there's a way for us to kind of get a reference to that controller that got created over here. And what we can do is we can do something like expect controller dot create, right? And you can see it auto completes the methods that I have because of TypeScript and such. So create, and it's expecting a create user DTO. So you can provide an object that has that shape. Let's take a look at there. It just requires a string. So I can provide a name. I'll just give my name in here. And then we can make assertions on what happens when you call this. So you, for example, maybe we want to say that this returns a new object that has an ID and a name, right? Maybe we do something like ID. So with just, we can do something like expect dot any, and I can pass a constructor in here to make it more specific. So for example, maybe let's say any number. And obviously if you're creating with this name over here, we should expect that to also come back as the name of what got created, right? And initially that's failing because our mock doesn't do that currently. If we take a look at user's controller, we see that it's simply passing the DTO down to a user service.create. So what we can do is in our mock user service up here, we can simply create a method called create that is a mock like this, right? So this gives us a fake implementation of the create method, and it also allows us to kind of provide a implementation like so. So for example, maybe I want to take that DTO and I wanted to return a object with whatever was in the DTO, and I also want to generate some kind of ID, right? Maybe let's just do date.now, right? And all of a sudden our test is passing because what's happening, right? We're calling our controller.create. Within the controller, that's going to call our user service.create. It passes our DTO down to the service, and our mock service is taking that DTO and just adding an ID to it, right? We're kind of fake simulating a database insert and an ID being created. All right, so that's really the basics of it. One might also ask, so another way of doing this is you can also, instead of overriding the provider, you can use the real one, but use spies, like just spies. The only problem with that is, as you can see, you need to set up all of the dependency chain to be correctly in this fake module, which means you'd probably have to deal with the dependencies of user service in this test, which you generally don't want to. So at least from my experience, it's often easier to just straight up mock the entire service, the entire dependency, and then provide a mock implementation like this. Another thing we can add here if you want is you can do assertions like, our mock user service.create that to have been called, right? And that should still be passing. You can even, it's up to you how specific you want this to be. So for example, you could also assert that it got called with this object, right? Right now it's going to fail because I didn't provide anything in there. It's saying I expected this method to have been called with this object, right? So if I provide that here, it should go back to passing. And you can do a little bit of cleanup if you want, like, put your DTO in a variable like so that you can kind of reuse it throughout your test, which is kind of nice, right? You can do something like that and everything's still passing. It's good. All right, so generally that's the basics of it. It's the unit tests, I think, are pretty simple. Basically, you just instantiate whatever you're trying to test and then provide a dependency, provide the mock of that dependency as needed, and then sort of just simulate calling every method that you have. So if I were to keep going with this, right, you'd see a test created for create, which we just did. You'd see one for find all, find one, update, remove. Let's do a test for our update here because this one, it has a lot of things in it. Let's again put this to the side. So you can do something like it should update a user. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and do our mock first this time around because it's just going to be simpler. Let's add an update just.fn. So the implementation of this, the mock implementation of this is pretty simple. Basically, we just want to create a user object that has an ID which we passed in, and the name from this update, right? So you can do kind of similar here. So you'll notice that over here on the update, it takes in 2 parameters, right? So we can do similar thing. We can do ID and DTO, and we just want to return basically an object that has that ID and whatever is in our DTO. Okay. And by the way, this is one syntax to do it with Jest. You can also do .mock implementation. I don't really know if there's a benefit to doing it this way, but FYI, you can do it that way too. Right, so we got our update, which basically just returns a fake user that has the updated name. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna do the same thing. We'll take this DTO and we'll do expect controller.update, and in this case it's requiring a string ID and a DTO. So in this case we'll pass in maybe 1, you know, whatever string ID, mock ID you want to provide in there, and then our DTO. And we expect that to come back with what? We expect it to have a shape like this, right? Because you'll notice that the controller is casting the string ID to a number. So you can kind of imagine that in our database we have integer IDs, right? So in a real environment, you can imagine that you call patch on /users/ID with a request body that includes a name, and it's going to return to you that updated user with that name. That's really what we're kind of trying to test in isolation here, right? And similarly, if you want to add that assertion that the service got called, it's up to you. Not really sure it adds that much more value, but you can do that. You know, you can just assert that to have been called. I think one reason I would probably leave these out is if you're trying to detach your test from the underlying implementation in the implementation details. You know, what if for some reason you switch the implementation to a different provider or service, but it still comes back with the same result. In that case, your test would be a little bit less brittle if all you had was this one and it didn't include that one. But it's pretty typical that you're going to use, you know, the service in the same module. So that's not bad to have there either. All right, so there's 3 tests for you. I'm not going to implement the rest of these controller methods because I think it should be pretty straightforward, right? If you're following along, I highly suggest you kind of use that as an exercise for yourself. Now, why don't we go ahead and switch to our user service and see how that differs a little bit from testing, right? So our user service, same thing. It's effectively just a class that has stuff being injected into it, right, as dependencies, and then it's got its own methods. All right, so let's take a look at the userService.spec file, and you should notice that it has sort of the same structure. And let's go ahead and switch our test to users.service. Right, so now we're switching to testing just the user service file, which we have here. Same thing, right? Initially, you kind of start with a fake module, and you want to make sure you provide all of your necessary dependencies and mock anything that you need to mock. So in our example here, again, we've got a constructor, and we see that there's a repository of type user being injected. So it's important for you to know sort of how do we simulate this injection in this test. Well, really it's really just another provider, and we can do something like this, and we're gonna do provide get repository token of type. You'll see that it's expecting a entity. And let me type this out and I'll explain it a little bit more in a second. So we want our user entity in here. And then similarly to how we were doing, you know, use value in our user controller test, you can see that this also allows us to provide a class or a factory or something existing. Again, I like to use a value here because it's just simpler, right? And I'm actually gonna extract that out to a mock users repository, and I'll provide it in here. All right, so again, you can kind of see that our test for it should be defined is now passing. So that's generally kind of your first test. Your first step with any test is make sure your dependencies are in place. Generally, if you have missing dependencies, as you saw in our previous examples, it's gonna fail. It's gonna say I couldn't construct this fake module because I didn't have everything that I was expecting, right? Like UserService was expecting this repository. We didn't provide a repository, so it was failing. And now we're providing a repository this way. And by the way, this is sort of just a slightly different syntax from what we were doing in the users controller over here, where we use override provider and use value. This is just another way to do it. This one specifically with mocking repositories is just a little bit more straightforward because you have to do this get repository token. Basically, we're trying to tell Nest what is the type of thing that we're trying to mock, and this is really like a special string that you have to provide to Nest so that it knows, yes, that is a type of a repository, specifically a user repository that you want injected, right? So really, it's the same idea as what we're doing over here, just a different way of doing it. All right, so same thing, kind of what we did before, right? We're unit testing again the user service in isolation. So kind of similar thing. Let's say that we were trying to test this create implementation, right? And you'll notice that when you do create, it requires a DTO, and it's going to do some kind of create and then save. So that means that our mock repository also needs to have a create and save method. So before we go ahead and test that, let's go ahead and improve our mock users repository to first have a create, which is another mock function, which takes a DTO. And effectively, if you saw my previous type-RAM video, what this create is doing is effectively it's just doing new user, right? And then it kind of sets the fields to whatever you pass into your DTO. So it would do, like, if this was user equals new user, it would do user.name equals name, right? If you have name in your DTO. So we could kind of just simulate it to just return the same DTO. You could also maybe have it instantiate the actual class if you want. And then our save, again, kind of similar thing, mock implementation, and kind of similar to what we've done in the controller, right? What this is really doing is it's taking that new object, saving it in the database, and then brings back that new record, which in this case would have an ID. So we're gonna again simulate the similar thing where we do something like, or really you can maybe do user here and have it return a new promise of an object that probably has an ID. Let's do another date there, or you can put in just any number that you want. And then we're gonna spread the user. And notice that we're providing a promise here because we're trying to sort of simulate the same thing, right? That this save returns a promise of a user, and we simply return that. So this entire method effectively returns a promise of a user, right? So now that we have our mock repository in place, let's go ahead and start writing our test. It should create a new user record and return that. One thing that's a little bit different here is since we're working with promises, we probably want to make this async. All right, so we can do something like expect await service dot create, and what do we need there? We need a DTO with a name. Same thing. To equal. And we can do, again, sort of similar strategies we did before. We can do something like expect dot any number and this name, right? And we get a passing test, right? So pretty similar, because if you think about it, the create controller method is really just calling this, right? So the mocks kind of end up pretty similar, but the difference is now you're mocking the dependency of the repository, the dependency of the user service, which is the repository, and you're providing the mock implementation a little bit differently. All right, so again, similarly, if you want to, you can add things like expect, create and save to have been called. But I have the same comment with this, right? Is that you might not want to add too much of the implementation details in your test, because it's going to make your code a little bit brittle if you change the implementation to, let's say that you switched your type-orm code here to do an insert, right? There's also an insert method like this one, repository then insert, and then maybe you switch to an insert in query, because insert doesn't return the inserted user. So ideally this test is still passing even though you change the implementation, but if you were asserting that these methods specifically got called, then it would fail. So I would try to add just whatever you need to kind of assert that your method is working, and don't try to add too much more than that. All right, so I'm not going to add any more tests for these guys either. I think you kind of get the point, right? It's pretty simple. If you're following along, again, I suggest you use it as practice. Maybe see if you can implement the rest of the user service methods here. Now, what I want to switch to is we've done a couple examples of unit testing. I want to switch over to integration testing, end-to-end testing specifically. So you'll notice when you create an app in NestJS using the CLI, it also creates you this test folder that has the E2E tests in it, and that also has a dedicated script, which you'll see is npm run test :E2E. The only thing different with this script is it doesn't have that watcher like we have. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to take this script and I'm going to add a watch version of this so that we can use it for development. So I'm just going to add the -- watch at the end of it. So it'll work similarly to this one, but it's specifically adding our E2E test. So let's go ahead and do npm run test E2E watch. And now it's running our app E2E test. So let's take a look at the initial test. So this is what was generated initially when we use the CLI to generate the application. It comes with this initial example test, and you'll notice that it's using super test. I think my last video was on TDD with Express Node.js, and it's also using super test. So that might be another good video for you to watch. But super test essentially allows us to take our application and then simulate, actual HTTP requests against that application, and then we can do assertions like this, like when you call that path, what does it bring back to you? So what's a little bit different with the before each part of these E2E tests is that you'll notice after it creates that fake module, it actually creates an instance of an application, right? If you compare that side by side with our user's controller test, you'll notice on the right here, we're simply just compiling the testing module and we're getting a reference to the controller. Here, it's actually taken in an import of the root module, and then it compiles that, and then it makes an actual mini application out of it, right? So it's composing all of the underlying dependencies of this module to create sort of a fake application on the fly, which you can test real HTTP requests against. Now, what you can see in this initial test that we have here is that it's starting from the very root app module, and it kind of attempts to create an application out of that. You can definitely do it that way, but I personally like bringing in modules individually, because in a more realistic application, right, your app module is going to have multiple other imports in it, and that kind of dependency chain is going to be really complex, and you're going to have a lot of things to mock. So sometimes it's easier or more simpler to test, if you think about it, like slices of your application. So rather than testing the entire app module, maybe in this case you want to test just the users module. It's definitely up to you, but I'm going to show you the way that I'm trying to talk about. So in this test folder, maybe I'll just create a new user.e2e, and we'll just follow that same naming convention -spec.ts. I'm actually going to copy this code and bring it over to our user one, but I'm just going to change this to user controller E2E, and I'm also going to have my test focus on the user E2E, right? So in this case, we're going to switch this up to specifically be the user module. So think of it as we're trying to effectively create a mini application just starting from our users module alone. So all right, so what do we have here? You know, let's say that ultimately we want to be able to do a /users get, and we expect, let's just start with, we expect to get back a 200, right? Really simple test. All right, so we're just running a basic test, and kind of similar thing. You'll notice that initially it's gonna fail for us when we haven't provided our dependencies properly. So within our users module, right, it's got user service, and within user service, again, it's got the repository, but there's nothing in our fake module that's providing this users repository. So it's telling us, hey, I can't resolve this dependency. So in that case, we should be the ones providing it. So like I told you, you can use the override provider, right? Similar strategy. And the same way that we're providing the, you know, similar how we're providing the token here, we're going to copy this, right? And you can, that's actually something you can also pass into here like that. Let's get our missing imports in, and then we're going to do use value mock users repository. And similar strategy, we can make that up here. And real quick, I don't know if this is just a problem with my setup, but I find that sometimes when I do auto importing with VS Code, it imports it from the base like this. That usually makes tests fail. So you want to make sure to update that to be relative. All right, so let's review real quick what we have here. We're saying we're instantiating our users module in isolation. But specifically, we want to override one of the things inside that module, which is specifically the users repository, kind of similar thing we're doing with the user service. And then we're just creating that module, and we're creating an app off of just that one module as if it was the root module. And then once we have that app, we can then start simulating HTTP requests against it and actually testing the integration of our entire module from controller to service to repository. This is also a place where maybe some people might want to provide an actual database connection, maybe like an in-memory database of some sort, maybe SQLite. That's up to you. I find that sometimes it's a little bit simpler to just mock the data layer, because that's the last layer in the chain, rather than incorporating a real database. It's up to you. It's really depends on what you're looking for with your test coverage. If you want it to be a little bit more real and there's less mocking, maybe integrating an actual database is more useful for you. But one thing you have to think about, if you incorporate an actual database, then you also have to think about making sure that you run migrations on that database so that it has the schema that it's supposed to have. So that part's a little bit more complex. In this tutorial, we're gonna keep it simple, and we're mocking the user's repository so that it still provides us an integration test that kind of makes our controller and service and data layer integrating together, so it still provides us a lot of value. All right, with all of that said, notice that now our test is still failing, but specifically because it can't find the find method on our user's repository. So same thing, if I start implementing that with just jest.fn, we should see that our test is passing, right? And what is this really doing is it does a get on /users. So in our users controller, it gets over here, and then it calls UserService.findAll, which UserService.findAll simply calls users repository.find and returns something, and that returns back a array of users. So if you wanted to make our test be a little bit more useful, maybe we do mock resolved value. Mock resolved value is just a sugar syntax to mock implementation, which returns a promise, kind of like what we did earlier. So if you're doing mock.resolve and you're just returning a value like that, if you just do mock resolved value, that is the syntactic sugar for that, right? And it actually says it right there, simple sugar for just fn, what I just said. All right, so perhaps you want to do something like, I don't know, let's say you had an array of mock users, right? And if you want, you can just return that. And then you can make your test a little bit better here, where you can do expect mock users, right? So you've got yourselves, it's effectively saying that if I make a call on /users using HTTP verb get, I should get status 200 and my array of users. You can also add a bunch of other things in here, like let me open up the super test documentation real quick. So you'll notice you can add stuff like, maybe you want to assert the header and stuff, like the content type. Maybe you want to assert that it's JSON. You can add that in there. All sorts of things you can put in here, so it's really up to you. And also notice that you can do all sorts of assertions as well on the thing that came back as a response. So I'm not going to go over everything about super test. I highly recommend you take a look at the documentation for that. But as long as you know how to set up your testing module and have it run through super tests like that, that's really the fundamentals that you need. Maybe let's do one more example of I want to be able to on /users post. So let's copy this and just change a little bit, right? In this case, we want to do a post. We still expect JSON to come back, but in our case, we want to return 201 because that's the default status that you usually get with a post in NestJS. And then rather than using this base expect here, I'm actually going to switch to I'm going to get the promise resolved value of that response, so that I can do something. I can use the jest assertions instead. So I can do something like response that body to equal, kind of similar thing we've been doing with ID. number, and we just have a name here. All right, so one thing that's missing, right, is we need to have a request body, which you do via send, which you do like this. And you probably already know why this is failing, right? Because we don't have our mock create and save, which you can actually just take this thing we did previously, right, in our user service mock repository. Let's bring that over up here. And now our test is passing. You can kind of think of it as we basically tested the same thing, except in this case, we're integrating our components together. We're making our controller and our service and our data layer actually work together. Why don't we add a little bit more of, let's add something different, right? So in our users controller, you'll also notice that in our create user DTO, we have validation in place. The name has to be a string, so we expect it to fail if maybe provide numbers. And if you saw in my previous videos, I talk about how to do validation pretty frequently. So let's copy this and let's do I don't know, I think this returns a 400 if there's a validation error. We'll remove this assertion. We'll switch this to 400. And to make this fail, we got to provide it with something that is not a string, in this case, numbers. And this is still failing because the thing that we use to enable our validation, if you saw the previous videos, is this global validation pipe. What we want to do is we actually want to enable that as well in our test. We should be able to just add that in here, and now our test is passing, right? That means that it's able to see that, hey, this is a number. It checks it again with class validator. It checks the DTO against class validator that it's a string, and then if it's not, it throws a specific HTTP exception. In this case, it will have a status of 400. Right, and if you want, you can do, let's just add an empty expector to see what the response body looks like, right? So it looks like that on the response. You can also, copy that if you want to. If you want to make your test a little bit more specific, right? So it's back to passing. Actually, there's also another way in the syntax with super testers. You can just add this as a second argument here on the initial status expect. That's also equivalent, right? So how much you assert is really up to you, and how specific it is. Again, it's up to you depending on how strict your tests want to be. You don't want to make it too, again, like I keep saying, you don't want it to be too tied to the implementation details, because you don't want your tests to be brittle. You effectively just want to test your stuff to simulate as much as possible how would a typical API consumer use your API. In this case, we're kind of saying that, oh, what if a user used our API and they provided a problematic non-string name? We want to make sure that a 400 validation error is thrown. All right, so that's it for today, folks. I don't think I'm gonna do any more examples here. Again, I didn't do the whole CRUD, right? If I did, it might take 2 hours, but I highly recommend you kind of do the other ones as practice if you're kind of new to this stuff. But if I were to summarize, right, the basic gist of it is in Nest, because it revolves around inversion of control and specifically dependency injection, is you just got to make sure that before you start your test, you set up your dependencies to be injected properly, mock any dependencies that you need to mock, and you go from there. All right, hopefully you found that pretty useful. Make sure to let me know in the comments what you think. If you have any feedback for me, I'd love to hear it from you. And with that said, have a good day, and I'll see you on the next video.